I've been thinking a lot about how my past life doing science communication relates to what we do now in science education research, where we often have some messages that we're trying to share with various audiences. And what I'm going to do today is give you a mishmash of both sort of some outlining of some questions and some thoughts and some ideas that I have about communicating basically DBER outside of DBER, and I'll tell you what that means. But I'm also going to give you sort of the brief version of a talk that I've given before, which is sort of how to do effective science communication, but I'm going to have it be tailored to what we do in education research. So instead of just, sorry, did I say science education? How to do effective science communication, but instead of just science communication, science research, science education research communication. So that's sort of the outline. So we'll be doing some discussion, and I've got a bunch of clips from NPR and stuff like that that we can listen to to sort of illustrate what we're talking about. So I think most of you know my story, but for those of you who don't, I'm at STF now in the physics department, but my bachelor's is actually in psychology, so I kind of already started out on a bit of a weird path, but I did get my PhD in physics. So I've just had this long-standing interest in how people think and how people learn and how our brains work. And while I was getting that graduate degree, I did a lot of freelance science journalism for newspapers, magazines, websites, Stanford Report, which is sort of like public information from that university. And based on that portfolio, I got a fellowship at National Public Radio through the AAAS. AAAS Mass Media Fellowship is a fellowship that's specifically for graduate students in the sciences to sort of train them to be effective communicators. The idea being that we want the next generation of scientists to be adept at explaining science. It ends up actually being a conduit instead to get graduate students interested in science communication into roles in science communication. So, and I was lucky enough that year to get the one at NPR. Nobody else asked for it. Like, go figure. So, and then from there, after my degree, most of you know I was at the Exploratorium as a postdoc. So that was my first postdoc. It's a science museum in San Francisco. And I was specifically doing teacher professional development for high school and middle school science teachers. And while I was there, I used a lot of my experience from NPR to create a couple podcasts. Those are those icons at the bottom. I did a podcast on nanotechnology called Small Talk, and one called Science Teaching Tips that was basically little nuggets that people could use in their classroom. So that's sort of like my range of experience, with communication and stuff. And now what I find myself doing is a lot of trying to tie things together in this interesting middle ground, to tie together what I've done in science education with what I've done in communication and writing. So I've done those videos, those clicker videos for faculty. I've been doing some podcasts for teachers in my outside work, and then I've also got my external business, which really what I'm doing a lot of is communication and translating and compiling information on teaching and education. So I'm finding it to be this sort of interesting middle ground. And I have been slowly working on, I got a grant from PERLOC, or PERTUG, the topical group for PER, to put together a podcast called Learning About Teaching Physics, which will be to communicate some of the essential nuggets of what we know from physics education research to working teachers. So that's something I'm in the process of doing. So that's sort of I'm really excited about that because it's kind of this great way to finally combine a lot of things that I've been working on. So before we launch into talking about communication, I want to talk about what communication isn't, because we talk a lot about disseminating research results and helping people engage in educational transformation, and this isn't that. So education is really about teaching process and content, getting people involved cognitively in the material and creating conceptual change. And it's things like workshops, our classes, stuff like that. If we the new faculty workshops, all of those would be educating people about education research. And that's what communication is not. That it's not an ongoing involvement with your audience. It's usually like 1 or 2 at best. Communication is more about information sharing. It's you've got a message and you want to get that message out. So it's really about trying to effectively convey something to some audience. And we'll talk about whether or not that's useful for the stuff that we do later on. So it can be public talks. I mean, this talk is communication. It's not trying to educate you. I'm just trying to share some general ideas. Museum exhibits. The media, journalism, those are all communication. NOVA programs, a lot of people are like, oh, well, isn't that education, and what in the science journalism world we call that edutainment. So it's fun, it's a little educational, but you're not going to get a deep understanding of, say, quantum mechanics by watching the Elegant Universe. You're going to get some ideas. So in our case, I'd say that our conference presentations are also communication, because we're often talking to people outside of our immediate field. So we're trying to get a message out more broadly. Separately from either of those is outreach, which is really about promoting public awareness and visibility. So generally it's that like an institution wants to promote visibility of what they're doing. So anything that PER at Colorado does, or DBER or ISTEM does to sort of try to promote the things that are happening in their program could be called outreach. And that could be public talks, science fairs, museums, science cafes. All these are sort of this more sort of general nebulous term of outreach. So I want to mostly talk about communication, but it involves some outreach. So I just want to make our terms really clear. So what communication really is like getting this message out, like translating something for an audience, talking about some topic to a group of non-specialists. In our case, it's talking about science education with non-scientists, with non-education scientists. In the case of science communication, it's more about talking about science with non-science specialists. That's what we're much more familiar with, is talking about science with non-science specialists. That's things like NOVA and Discover magazine and stuff like that. But what I think is that we can take a lot of the messages from that communication of science messages to communication of messages about science education research. So there's a variety of different things that this could be. We could be communicating about specific pedagogical strategies. We could be trying to communicate the results of a particularly interesting study, like Michelle's Quicker study got some press outside of just our academic circle. So that was a study that was communicated broadly. Common themes and take-home messages, like interactive engagement is important. That's one of our big messages that we're always trying to get across. Or they can be discipline-specific results, like common misconceptions in a certain area. These are all the sorts of things that we like to try to communicate. So I want to pause now and talk about whether or not we think that this idea of communication is useful for discipline-based education research stuff. Given what we know about how hard it is for people to change the way that they think about teaching, and how difficult it is when we're working with faculty to have them deeply embrace some of the things that we want them to embrace based on our research, is it even useful to engage in communication and outreach as opposed to those longer workshops? Turn to your neighbor and talk for a minute, and we'll come back together in a minute.
All right, Steve, we got if I'm going to get a job in this field, it's good for my job. Because you're important when the paper is communication relevant, then you want to be sure that and let the order, like me communicate. Okay, I never.
I've never really thought of
You're saying that we just have communicated the idea really well, so it's out there, so it's easy to get something, and then specifically communication is part of the proposal.
Even if it's just like raising hours, if you're saying like talking to like other
I'll find out some more about.
surface level.
Yeah. You know, I might like that to know more about that.
Okay.
So if that's, sounds like about 10 seconds to wrap up the discussion.
That's what I had, so.
I think it depends on what your goals are. Yeah, the hard thing to decide.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
It seemed like everybody kind of set up.
Okay, let's share a few things that people talked about. Anyone want to share whether or not they think they decided that communication is useful or not?
So this is somewhat theoretically based, but mostly practical. Anytime you want to communicate effectively, you should know your audience. And if our audience is faculty, that's a very particular audience. It's not a typical audience. And one characteristic of most faculty is curiosity. And so, in fact, even though you can't communicate a lot, if you communicate a little bit and it gets their interest, a pretty good percentage of faculty will go, I want to see more. I don't know what pretty good means, but I think that's an effective strategy with some faculty.
So if your audience is faculty, you might plant that seed.
You know, you get the Stanford multitasking study. Maybe you only tell them part of the results. You know, that's what I mean by trying to get people's
Curiosity. Okay, great. Other ideas?
You can give your personal.
I heard a lot of conversation.
Well, Steve has to.
I was just pointing out that communication doesn't, in my own case, it was insufficient to change my teaching or really inform me about my teaching. But it was communication in the form of some public talks by Eric Mazur and Lillian McDermott that started me on a path. So I cannot dismiss communication as being useless, even though locally it might be useless. So we should
stand on that.
So we should go home now.
I think it's kind of useful for getting like non-teachers to see the value of education research. So like whether they're like funding agencies or like just foundations with lots of money or like university officials who might have an interest in.
Yep, I was hoping someone would bring up the policy kind of aspects. Yeah, that there are people other than the people who we're trying to change that should be interested in these results.
Colorado Matters 2 days ago. 1 day ago on the radio. Carl White.
Yep, heard that.
Oh, he was on.
Yeah, yesterday.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, so I'm curious how you distinguish communication between with public relations, because often, you know, I look at those little science tidbits where every significant observation from a research university is touted as, you know, the other day, you know, Carl Wyman may be, but, you know, somebody puts telomerase back into a mouse and the mouse doesn't die as early. You know, next thing you know, we're all going to live forever, right? And so, and I can assure you that you should still have a life insurance policy.
Right. So yeah, those sorts of PR things like, oh, science is great or science education research is great. I would say it's in that fuzzy nether region between outreach and communication. Because you're communicating something, but you've got this real agenda that you're trying to push.
The agenda is sort of lobby, because, you know, science education without a demand for improved science learning is
Yeah. So and I think that,
irrelevant.
you know, it's we often get stymied as communicators, and I heard this when talking with Steve a couple of weeks ago in terms of people seeing us as salesmen. And so that PR thing can work against us in terms of blocking people from hearing our message.
Well, I'd like to contradict that.
Uh-huh.
Okay? It depends on what audience you're talking about. You know, again, if you're talking about an academic audience, they're skeptical. Okay? But as far as I know, and I haven't never taken a course in broadcasting and so forth, but my experience tells me that for a pretty good section of the public, if they hear something just mentioned multiple times, it raises in their consciousness and in the importance that they attribute to it. Okay? So, if you want more people generally in Colorado to appreciate that, you know, research is one very effective way of pushing education forward, then 5 people giving little talks that don't transmit that much information can still raise the public consciousness a lot.